Hey everybody, Bernie says hi to me and to you. Well, I'm very happy to be with you all tonight. Do you guys know why? Because we're discussing a new topic today, and that topic is civil society and protest politics. And the reason I like this so much is because we get to talk about ordinary people for once. We don't have to talk about elites and dictators and military generals and all these terrible, figures that normally we learn about in movies. We get to talk about the role of ordinary people and students and peasants and workers and teachers and human rights activists and lawyers and these types. So I'm looking forward to it a lot. And we're going to have a great discussion that will be both theoretically and empirically rich. We'll watch some videos. We'll have a really good time, just like Bernie is right now. He's really enjoying getting some love. He just woke up from a long nap. He took a snooze, as we like to say. But does anyone out there have a cat or like a dog or like a parrot or something, or like a bunny? Does anyone want to share their screen and like show them loving their cat or something? I mean, we can kind of mellow out for a few minutes before we get started if you want to. So this is Bernie. He's about 6 months old. Oh, we have one. Aww. Bernie sees it too. Look, Bernie, it's a friend. Lovely. Thank you. Thank you, Joanna. Anybody else have anyone they want to share? Oh, Rocio's got a doggy. How cute. Say hi to the doggy. So this is Bernie. He's 6 months old, and we got him in July. And we got him at like the height of the pandemic, and he had been rescued from underneath like a mobile home, like in Fishkill in the Hudson Valley. And he's just such a wonderful little kitten, and he just brightens our day every day. And so being locked up with him is just a blessing. But we also have an older cat, Cadence, and she's lovely too, and he terrorizes her, but we just have a lot of fun. So it's always fun to get started in a light way, and we can do this however often you want. It's only like 5 or 6 minutes that we devoted to the cats and the dogs, but we love our furry friends, and they keep us light and carefree. So let's begin to get started talking about these ordinary people that I'm so excited about, which includes us. And I will do so by getting things set up here. So as I said, we are discussing popular mobilization, civil society, protest, all of those activities that really reside in the domain of popular uprisings and popular rebellion, revolution, even if you want to go as far as using that term. But the reason this is so different from everything we've talked about so far is because it takes us away from those elite discussions and negotiations that we so often associate with democratization. And it focuses our attention on ordinary people. It's ordinary people who bring about revolution. It's ordinary people who facilitate popular uprisings and who coordinate and mobilize that kind of opposition to an authoritarian regime. And so this is our focus today, but really our focus in particular gradually will be peaceful popular protest. And the reason we'll focus on peaceful popular mobilization is because of the merits of peaceful mobilization and the ways that peaceful mobilization is often more successful than violent mobilization. And then finally, we'll discuss some examples that it will include Tunisia, the Philippines, South Africa, and Nepal. So our starting point is the simple fact that democratization never just happens. It always takes action. And whenever there's action, there are actors. This is a point that was always lost on the structural approach, because the structural approach, remember, focuses on those remote characteristics of society that then determine the behavior of individuals. It takes agency and action and choice out of the equation and really attributes outcomes to those remote features of the environment that are beyond the reach of humans. But the truth is, even if humans respond to those structures, it's the humans themselves who have to act to install or protect democratic institutions. And usually that someone is political elites. Most of the discussions that we've had have focused on the roles of elites, key actors, institutions, the ways that they facilitate democratization. But sometimes there's another forceful actor, the population itself, who pushes for or resists change in a way that becomes quite consequential. And really the key question for us today concerns the importance of the population as an actor in democratization. We want to address the question, did popular mobilization affect the third wave of democratization? Did popular protest and revolution and social rebellion and uprising exert some impact on the third wave, as we've called it, that period of time spanning roughly the 1970s and the present that was characterized by the largest burst of democratizations the world has ever seen? Did popular mobilization affect that period? This is our question for today. Now, normally, the discussion in democratization studies focuses on those elites, those pesky elites that I've talked so much about. The strategic approach would answer this question relatively succinctly by simply saying that no, there's really no role for masses. In fact, democratization requires mass demobilization. Quite apart from mobilization, democratization actually requires removing masses and taking them out of the equation. Now, this is a pretty incredible idea because it suggests that all of society is irrelevant when it comes to what happens to an authoritarian regime and whether it transitions to democracy. Society is irrelevant and elites really are the ones who matter. But that society is who those elites ultimately came from, and they ultimately would depend on that society in a variety of ways that may be more or less obvious. But this idea was soundly based on the Latin American and Southern European traditions. Remember that in countries like Chile and even in Argentina, much of the transition revolved around a kind of game that began between elites within the regime and within the pro-democratic opposition. Even in a country like Argentina, it ultimately came down to military generals in the regime deciding to call elections in some negotiation with political parties. Not as much negotiation as in Chile, of course, but the point remains that the strategic approach does do a good job for the most part explaining the Latin American and Southern European transitions, even if it requires us to accept that masses play a less important role. But the problem with this approach, the problem with this idea that elites alone determine democratization, is that later transitions in Asia, Southern Europe, and Africa exhibited a very different pattern. In fact, popular protest replaced elite negotiation as the key factor in those transitions. In countries like Thailand, in countries like South Africa, in countries like South Korea, and in countries like Ukraine, there was a very important role for popular protest and popular mobilization. And in fact, it's not possible to understand the behavior of elites without understanding the pressure exerted by popular protest and popular mobilization. But even if we go back to Latin America, you'll find something interesting, which is that the negotiated transitions in Latin America were also, in some ways, the product of popular protest. Take the example of Chile. This is the canonical case of a negotiated transition. It took place in 1990. It involved a game between the authoritarian elite and the pro-democratic opposition. But what this strategic picture of the Chilean transition ignores is the fact that in 1984, there were huge mass protests against the regime in favor of democracy. These protests erupted in response to the failure of the regime to contain the economic crisis. And so even in a case like Chile, the truth is that popular protest came before the elite negotiations that eventually gave way to the transition. And so what I want to suggest to you as we get started and as we set out is that the strategic approach is short-sighted. Though the elite transaction is often very important, there's a critical role for masses and for ordinary people in sort of moving the goalposts and exerting pressure and making it more costly for elites to hold the line and remain in power within that authoritarian regime. So we're going to pause. We're going to watch a video that puts this in perspective by taking a look at the June democracy movement in South Korea. Now, remember that I told you that South Korea is an excellent example of increases in education levels, in the expansion of the middle class, supporting mass protests that could create pressure for democratization, and that eventually did so. So I'm going to stop the recording because if I don't, YouTube will block the video on copyright grounds. I'll pause the recording temporarily and then I'll continue it when we're done with the video. But this will take about 2.5 minutes. It gives us a good insight into the case. So there were some really important elements of that, including the fact that the June democracy movement spanned a variety of social classes. It was a social movement of social movements in the sense that it was without class or distinction. People of all backgrounds in South Korea joined the movement to protest the military's choice to name the next president. And the size and the scope and the intensity of the protest really forced the military to call elections and respond meaningfully to the demands of the protesters by setting up and putting in motion a process that would lead to democratization. And so South Korea's June democracy movement really captures a lot of what we think of as characteristic of these social movements and this societal protest and this popular mobilization that often can give way to democratization under the right circumstances.
Now we're going to take a deeper look.
Hopefully the video does not get brought down because I played 2 seconds of the video. This is another example of a democratization that was driven largely by popular protest. This is the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004. This is a moment where the authoritarian regime at the time was confronted more or less by popular protest and mobilization, protesters demanding democratic elections and the transfer of power to a democratically elected government. And this is what happened in 2004 in response to the Orange Revolution. Now, the Orange Revolution was just one example of what we call the color revolutions that took place in Eastern Europe. And all of these color revolutions were characterized by immense popular protest and large gatherings, huge, enormous throngs of protesters in cities. There's video out there on YouTube that you can find of military units abandoning their tanks and their weapons and joining the protesters in places like Ukraine as they marched on city streets on their way to like presidential palaces in their effort to oust these dictators. Really inspiring stuff. And it goes to the heart of the kind of popular basis of the revolution in places like Ukraine and elsewhere. But South Korea and Ukraine other cases in Asia and Eastern Europe, including Thailand and others, these are examples of popular mobilizations that caused democratic transitions in a real material way. Now, there is another approach that we've discussed that's more sensitive to mass mobilization and some of the potential benefits for democratization. That is the social forces tradition. Remember that the social forces tradition really stands in stark contrast to the kind of elite strategic approach, because the social forces tradition focuses on masses, or at least social groups that are larger in scope and are viewed as bigger, more organized, and more collective actors. So the social forces approach really puts an important role on protest activity. There's a crucial role for organized labor and unions and other social groups who can be instrumental in organizing opposition to dictatorships and authoritarian regimes. But remember that the social forces tradition largely focuses on strikes. And in particular, the work on Latin America has largely focused on union activity and strikes, and the ways that strikes and union activity can become consequential and triggers for democratization. But strikes are actually only one example or one type of protest activity from the perspective of social forces and really in general. And there are other types as well that include like peaceful demonstrations in the form of sit-ins, or maybe something like turning out the lights at a certain time all across the country so as to generate solidarity. Things like the umbrella movement in Hong Kong, which represent peaceful protest and organized solidarity, the behavior being hold an umbrella to show the unity from protester to protester. But riots are also another form of protest activity. And what I want you to notice is that peaceful demonstrations are different from riots and strikes. Peaceful demonstrations are peaceful, right? They involve peaceful tactics and nonviolent means. Riots and strikes, by contrast, are by their very nature confrontational and adversarial. Riots in particular tend to involve violence. Strikes can also involve violence. For instance, in Argentina, the unions have traditionally been rather thuggish, and strikes have often been relatively violent affairs, not just because it involves a work stoppage, but because it might also involve, for instance, workers running into the headquarters of a company and taking the shirt off of the boss and kidnapping them and taking them to a secret location. These are all things that have happened and that are real examples of strike activity. But I want you to put a pin on that, because the rest of the discussion that we'll have today will really focus on evaluating these different types of protest activity and thinking about the merits and maybe the pros and the cons of the different types. And what I want to ask you before we continue, and I really want to kind of sit back and discuss this, is which form of mobilization is most conducive to bringing about change? Riots, strikes, or peaceful demonstrations, and why? This is a question that doesn't just relate to democratization. This is a question that relates to all social reform. This is a question that all of us, inevitably, if we feel political at all, have maybe wrestled with from time to time, thinking about what is the best way to bring about change, assuming you determine what kind of change you want to bring about. You know, should we engage in riots? Should we engage in strikes? Or should we engage in peaceful demonstrations? What do you think? What is your instinct? You don't need to know the answer to this question. It is kind of an empirical question in the sense that we have answers to this question, but I want to know what you think. Kind of according to your understanding, or what you've seen out there in the world, or based on your experience, are riots, strikes, or peaceful demonstrations more effective?
I think that peaceful demonstrations are the most effective because it's the hardest for leadership or the previous leadership to pass it off as just mobs, and peaceful demonstrations are easier to put forth those specific goals than riots.
So Ishan, I want to press a little bit. So why is it harder for leaders to just kind of pass off or disregard or ignore peaceful demonstrations?
Because in the case of riots, there is usually stuff being destroyed and looted. So it becomes easier for leadership to focus on the damage being done and sort of the outer effects of a riot, whereas peaceful demonstration and has a message that isn't diluted by those factors.
Okay. Can we get
Um,
oh, please, please.
so I was gonna say that so people's demonstrations, yes, they're obviously the way to go, but think about a lot of the times peaceful demonstrations do not work. And you see things are still happening, like as people are attempting to protest peacefully. And at one point, like riots might happen and they'll be inevitable. And the reason that they happen and they create such a stark impact is because you can't really ignore them. Are you going to prioritize like what people are you going to prioritize a burning building or the lives that are being killed for the reason the protests are even happening in the first place? You have to really think about the response to whatever form of mobilization you're leading to. It's not that it's you got to keep in mind like what will lead up to what. Like riots don't just start out of nowhere. They come and build up from multiple times of peaceful demonstrations and the other side constantly aggravating, and at the end you just really have nowhere else left to go. And a lot of the times that's kind of how change has to be made.
Okay. So this interesting kind of tug of war sort of between like, well, what will bring about change and what is visible and what will be impactful versus what will kind of stay within the boundaries of acceptability. Maybe those two are separate things, and maybe in the end you need to kind of move the needle, so to speak, and maybe you need to create a problem for someone, and maybe that takes the form of non-peaceful protest. It's kind of a nuanced discussion, and it's kind of hard to really put a pin on it because it might depend on different situations, right? Can we hear from some more people and hear some different perspectives before I read some of these comments in the chat, some of these juicy contributions?
Yeah, if I may add, I feel that peaceful demonstrations sound cool on paper. I'm not gonna lie, right? And then with the current protests, people have been like, "Oh, we gotta do peaceful demonstrations," right? But we look back at past and people talk about MLK or any of these protests. They don't talk about how the police after did their own brutality, right? So I feel it depends. Like we can have peaceful protesters, but how are protesters gonna have to react to the severity or the brutality of the regime that's trying to use against them? For example, the Philippines a couple, I think 40, 50 years ago, I think it was Duterte, people were having peaceful demonstrations, and it was to the point where the Catholic Church got involved and the regime was still attacking them, and then the own soldiers ended up backing up. And then I feel it's like a scope, right? Like you can start with peaceful demonstrations, then go to strikes, and then go to riots, because at the end of the day, right, like a riot, we're putting that value on a thing. And I feel that a riot, that's where the regime is like, oh, well, they're destroying buildings, let's put in the force. Although that's how people think, right? But I feel it all depends on the situation. But it's not like to get convoluted on the language. It's also to get, I feel it's time to understand that all these mobilizations happen for a reason, and at each level that they're at is because it built up. Like people are not gonna be like, hey, tomorrow let's go riot City Hall. It's like, no, it built up from a peaceful demonstration. That did not work. The people are like, hey, let's do a strike. That did not work. And then it went to a riot, in my opinion. Like it's not just like people just go out like that. It's because people are not being heard in the certain circumstances.
Interesting. And I think to your point, Arturo, if we think about like the popular uprising that began in October of last year in Chile over a subway fare increase that kind of triggered dissatisfaction with the wider economic and political system. If we think about that, it did begin as peaceful protests, more or less. The truth is, there was some rioting that began among college students, but it was largely a peaceful protest that grew in size. And the rioting and the violence that did occur was largely kind of like a spin-off from that peaceful protest. And the peaceful protests really were the bulk of what took place. But I think there was a kind of seamlessness in the way that the rioting and the violence grew out of some of the kind of exponential growth of the collective action itself. And so there's an interesting point there, and they may not be as separate as my question implies.
But if I may add quickly, I'm sorry, I just wanted to make a point, is that like, it also depends on the media, right? Like, for example, there's colleges, or like when your favorite team wins and you're from that city, you know, people burn down cars or whatever. It's predominantly white neighborhoods, and people are like, hey, we're protesting because our team won. But then you have like Black Lives Matter movements, and people are here protesting for their own lives, and the media focuses on the violence, focuses on the riots, right? So I feel it also depends, in my opinion, to also do with the media, like how and who frames it and who gets to write about it. Because how is one different from the other, in the sense that like one is people burning down buildings because their team won, but that's not right. That's a protest. But then one is people fighting for their own lives, but somehow that's not a protest. That's a riot. So I feel it depends on the media too.
Yeah, I think that reality is certainly constructed, and that plays a role, without a doubt. Can we hear from some more folks about this question about the different types of protest and whether they're equally effective, or if we should go with one over the other? Julissa says, I personally think it depends on the situation. I would personally go with strikes or peaceful demonstrations because I believe that there is power in numbers and in the voices of the people. It's hard to ignore thousands of protesters demanding change, so it holds a strong message and brings about change. I do agree with what Daniela is saying, though, which is why it also depends on the situation. Certainly, and the size of the protest might also depend on the type of protest, as we shall see, because peaceful demonstrations are relatively more inclusive in terms of who can be involved than are, say, strikes or riots, which often have certain requirements. Maybe you need weapons, or maybe you need something. Maybe you need to be part of a union or something like that. Peaceful demonstrations and popular demonstrations and protests can often be inclusive of everyone, and that strength in numbers can often be the difference between maybe the effectiveness of a peaceful demonstration and the failure of a smaller riot. And we'll talk about that later on in this discussion. Tyler says, I feel like peaceful demonstrations are the most ideal way to bring change, but I feel like sometimes those movements are often overlooked. I feel like rioting and violence often bring the problem much more attention, creating faster change, but it does depend on the situation and what is at stake. Yeah, Tyler, so to go back to my example of Chile, the truth is that those who committed violence during the uprising, they brought about literally billions of dollars of property damage. And that enormous property damage caught the attention of politicians. And there were a lot of elites in Chile that got really, really scared. And there's a real good shot that property violence and the fear that was struck in their hearts led them to the negotiating table. And it's the reason that Chile is currently rewriting its constitution, and why they're looking at, a new political order in the coming years, and why there were so many concessions that have already been made to the protesters. And so I think that there's something to that, and that's maybe uncomfortable for some of us who don't gravitate towards violence. And I'm not suggesting that any of us do necessarily, but the fact that property damage can be a trigger for change is a provocative idea, and it's an incendiary one, no pun intended. Carla says, I feel like peaceful protests are people's ideal form of protest. However, it seems like strikes and riots bring more awareness and make people talk about issues they wouldn't usually be talking about. It leaves a higher impact on people. Yeah, so the visibility of the event might matter as well. And maybe strikes and riots achieve that in ways that peaceful demonstrations don't, perhaps because of the fact that riots and strikes are usually covered more widely by the news media than, say, a peaceful demonstration. Karen says, I think strikes are more conducive to bringing change because the people use force to show that they will take their stand until their voices are heard. Okay, so we'll meet gunfire with gunfire, we'll meet force with force, and maybe that show of force matters greatly. What I would encourage us all to think about is, when do we kind of bark up the wrong tree? That is to say, doesn't the state have at its disposal weaponry and means of inflicting violence that are much greater than what we have access to? And are our strikes capable of kind of bringing the state to kind of cow in that way, or will they simply double down and use repression to crush any opposition? I think that's often the question in the heat of the moment. You know, what option should we choose, and what kinds of consequences will follow with regard to the state's response to our behavior? Carla says, however, I don't necessarily know or think that one or the other bring about change more than the other. Yeah, so Carla, it is kind of that empirical question, right? And we'll take a look in a moment at specifically how riot strikes and peaceful demonstrations affect the propensity to democratize. And we'll see if one of those types of protest is more effective at causing democratization than others. And so there sort of is an answer to this question, but you're right, it kind of is an empirical question. And unless we have that data, we don't really know. But we do have that data, and I'll show you here in a moment. Daniela says, exactly, it's a lot about the oppressor's reactions to the peaceful demonstrations, like the 2020 BLM demonstrations. Yeah, without a doubt. Look at the ways that Black Lives Matter has successfully changed the discussion and changed the terms of the debate. We're focusing correctly on issues of racial justice, and this debate has only just begun. But the response to Black Lives Matter has often been vicious and repressive, but the response has also helped to elevate the message of Black Lives Matter, and their peaceful demonstrations have been very effective in changing the terms of the debate. And you know what else is an example of peaceful demonstrations that have changed the terms of the debate? The Occupy Wall Street movement from more than half of a decade ago. That was another movement that was effective at changing the terms of the debate. Much of the debate, in particular among Democrats right now, about how far left to go with regard to some of these social reforms, goes back to some of the demands issued by Occupy Wall Street and progressive elements in the Democratic base that began to really mobilize in the early 2010s. Karen says, I think it also depends on the situation. Daniela says, peaceful protest is always the ideal option, but it does not always work. And that's why the other forms of mobilizations exist. Tyler agrees. Yoel says, the 13 colonies didn't leave the grasp of King George by sitting down and asking nicely to bring about change. I'm ready for this. However, peaceful protests and sit-ins from the 60s led by civil rights leaders and leftist groups were met with violence from police forces. When in primary school, we're taught the Pledge of Allegiance as children, but never given a manual on how to protest the right way. The hollerings of the oppressed will sound louder than those with privilege. I think Yoel's point is to say that the situation does matter, but who's using different types of protest also matters. And it matters because it will shape the response of the oppressor, as Yoel has so aptly put it. In the example of violent protest and violent uprising against King George in the American Revolution is obviously one that stands in stark contrast to the peaceful protests and sit-ins of civil rights activists who were crushed with dogs and with menacing violence by security forces in the 50s and the 60s. And moreover, in primary school, as Yoel is pointing out, we're taught the Pledge of Allegiance as children, but never given a manual on how to protest the right way. That seems to be indicative of who that protest could potentially harm. And really, who could it harm? We're talking about the state, right? The regime, the kind of status quo. Jaleesa says, the only problem with riots, kind of like what we saw with the Black Lives Matter protests, is that a lot of people will join in for the wrong reasons. Many white non-people of color rioted for the wrong reasons, shifting away from the true purpose and demonizing the Black Lives Matter movement as a whole. which I do not think is effective because it does nothing. If there are riots, they have to be done in the right way and effectively to get voices heard and make change without bringing a bad name to anyone or anything. And Julissa meant non-Black people of color. Okay. And I think that Julissa is right in pointing out that the message can kind of be distorted, especially when there's when the movement itself is decentralized, and when there's really no kind of clear hierarchy, and when many different actors in many different places are kind of making decisions and taking decisions independently. In that rioting that kind of happens on the edges can change the way that the movement is received. And so that's, I think, an important point. Arturo says, no taxation without representation. The Boston Tea Party, this country is afraid of protests that affect the status quo after they are what helped it establish independence from England. Ariana says, I think strikes and riots have a bigger effect because they have more money involved with relation to property damage, etc. Whereas we can only hope a peaceful demonstration can get the right media attention. Okay, so this is what I hoped for, that we could get thinking about these different types of protest and to what degree they're effective at bringing about the kind of change that we would like to see in the world. And what I said to you before is that this is really an empirical question, right? And it's a question that we have evidence on. And that evidence is what you see here before you. And this evidence came from the reading for today. And the question is, how do riots, strikes, and peaceful demonstrations impact the propensity to democratize the following year? And what this data shows us, as indicated by the 3 stars next to the coefficients for peaceful demonstrations, is that only peaceful demonstrations have a positive, significant impact on democratization. As you can see here, riots and strikes have a negative relationship with democratization, as if to say, the more riots and strikes there are, the less likely a country is to democratize. In contrast, the more peaceful demonstrations there are, the more likely a country is to democratize the following year. In general, there's also likely to be increases in the level of democracy even after a country has democratized. And so not only are transitions more likely in the aftermath of peaceful protests, but increases in the level of democracy are as well. And again, riots and strikes are negative on that for the same reason. And what this means for us is that peaceful means are apparently the most effective triggers, at least as far as democratization is concerned. Now, there are many other forms of social reform. Democratization is just one example of a type of social reform, but undoubtedly it's an important one. And it's one that we kind of have an ethical and a moral commitment to because of the kinds of things that we associate with democracy: responsiveness, accountability, transparency, etc. But the takeaway and the important point here is that apparently, according to the evidence that we have available to us, peaceful demonstrations are the route that we should take if we seek to bring about social reform. If we're seeking to redistribute power and wealth, if we're seeking to enfranchise new groups and promote the rights and the representation of minorities and increase transparency and accountability, and above all, to bring about democratization, we should be engaging in sit-ins, we should be engaging in other forms of peaceful protest. We should not be striking, we should not be rioting, we should not be using violence, at least according to this data. Now, this is interesting because it kind of makes us think twice about some of those ideas that we might have had about the relative importance of different types of protest, and whether, for example, riots and strikes might become more important because of the visibility in the impact of property damage. But we'll consider in a moment why it's the case that peaceful protest is more important. Before we do that, let's take a look at some examples of peaceful protest movements that in recent years have sought to bring about democratization in their respective country. And one example is the Umbrella Movement in Hong Kong since 2014. Now, this is a pro-democracy movement, and it's a movement that has not just sought democracy in Hong Kong, but a separation from China and autonomy and sovereignty from China. And this umbrella movement has been distinctive because of, well, not just the umbrellas, but because of the scope of the movement and because of how inclusive it is of all generations of Hong Kongers, but in particular students and young people and workers. Now, the umbrella movement is an inspiring example because in Hong Kong, the security forces have used a lot of repression against the protesters. But even so, the umbrella movement has remained largely peaceful, and it's an example of a peaceful protest movement. However, it's not an example of a successful peaceful protest movement from the vantage point of democratization, because in Hong Kong, we know that the needle hasn't moved much in terms of democratization or democratic reforms. Although there have been some important concessions, including, for example, the withdrawal of the bill that was originally intended to permit China to extradite Hong Kong citizens to China for prosecution. Now, the umbrella movement is similar to, for example, the Green Wave in Iran. The Green Wave is another example of a popular protest movement that seeks to bring about a democratic transition. And it's a peaceful protest movement in that it seeks to use nonviolent means to bring about that outcome. Now, we know that in Iran, the military is enormous and the security forces are very, very robust and very, very much aligned with the state. And it's a theocratic authoritarian regime in Iran. And so there's an added element of institutional complexity that goes along with the size of the security force and the repressive military apparatus. And so the Green Wave has its work cut out for it, much like the Hong Kong umbrella movement does. The Green Wave also has not been successful in bringing about a democratic transition, but it clearly has identified and articulated a well-defined preference for democracy. And that alone has been a success because of the difficulty often of coordinating and organizing these enormous popular movements for democracy. And really remember that these movements are operating under very, very difficult circumstances. They're subject to extreme repression. These people are exiled and sent to other countries. They're imprisoned and murdered. Sometimes they're left for dead and dropped into the ocean from a helicopter with bricks, tied around their legs. These are the kinds of things that sometimes await those who challenge the regime in a repressive dictatorship, Iran just being one more example. But nevertheless, it's an inspiring example because it shows us that even in the most brutal repressive regimes, there are freedom fighters and there are social movements that take up the cause. Arturo says, these regimes have real sci-fi looking weapons being used to attack their people, to suppress the voice of the people. I feel it is hypocritical for the USA elites to be supporting pro-democracy movements in other countries, but failing to do so domestically. Without a doubt, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. This is a protest in Egypt during the Arab Spring. Now, the Egyptian Arab Spring, or the Egyptian Revolution, did give way very, very briefly to democracy. That democracy was quickly toppled in a military coup, but Egypt was, for a very short time, viewed as somewhat of a success. And in this regard, peaceful protest in Egypt produced a different outcome than it did in, say, Syria or many other Middle Eastern countries that also saw popular uprisings during the Arab Spring, which took place in the early 2010s. But again, what we see are ordinary people. We see, mothers and grandmothers and workers and teachers and students and peasants and children and bus drivers and sanitation workers and chefs and busboys, you name it. These are the people involved in these protests. These are ordinary people who don't find themselves within an inner circle or among the favored elite. And it's that essence of kind of popular protest that really characterizes popular mobilization. And this is the nature of popular protest. Now, at this point, you might be asking, though, are there not other forms of violent confrontation, like, say, civil war, that can lead to a democratic transition? Like we just talked about how, for example, war can be a cause of a democratization from an international perspective. If it's like an interstate war. Can't a civil war also cause a democratic transition? After all, it's actually been shown that 40% of them from 1945 to 1993 led to a rise in the levels of democracy in those given countries. Now, there are some theoretical reasons why this might be the case, if in fact civil war can lead to democratization. For example, it's possible that the parties to a civil conflict might invite the people as arbitrator, hold elections, elect a democratically elected government and pass power to that government, and use that as a mechanism of conflict resolution. Democratization therefore becomes a solution to civil war. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that armed conflict helps resolve collective action problems that arise in the course of attempts to oust an authoritarian government. Now, what does that mean? Well, whenever we try to overturn an authoritarian government, we have a lot of work to do. We've got to come together and unify and achieve a kind of solidarity that is substantial enough for us to overthrow a very powerful, well-organized entity in that authoritarian government. That means we need to solve what we call collective action problems. We need to give different actors and groups an incentive to join hands with us. We need to become better at policing those different actors and groups so that they don't defect from the group's actions once we form that solid kind of core, that collective group. And we need to make sure that different members of the group benefit relatively equally from the eventual outcome, that democratic regime. It's possible then, from this perspective, that armed conflict, in the way that it forces societies to organize themselves into units, helps resolve those collective action problems and helps them to kind of reduce those different difficulties associated with coming together and unifying. And in the course of that, they become capable of ousting an authoritarian government. Now, the truth is, even though these are really sexy theoretical reasons for why civil war might cause democratization, there's actually no basis whatsoever in the data for them. Neither explanation is supported by the evidence. And the reason we know this is because we can look at the propensity to democratize at different points in time in civil wars that occur in countries that have them. What we find is that during the third wave, there's been little effect, if any at all, of civil war. And so even though the earlier sort of post-World War II period seemed to correspond with a role for civil war in promoting democratization, that same relationship doesn't seem to hold during the third wave. Now, that's a little bit discouraging for those of us who want to take up arms and fight a civil war for the purpose of deepening democratization. But I think that if we're willing to fight a civil war, maybe we can try first with strikes or riots, and we can see if those work, and maybe we can consider other options later. But my point to you is that there are different forms of popular uprisings and popular confrontation. Those different forms are not created equal. And in addition to having little impact on democratization, empirically speaking, civil war is incredibly costly because it results in an untold death and bloodshed, and it's a merciless, agonizing fate for society. And it's very unlikely to lead to democratization, so don't try it. So the question then arises, if we're so persuaded that peaceful popular mobilization is the ticket, why is it so important? And why do popular mobilizations foster democratization? Why must they be peaceful? And what's really going on here? How is it that peaceful protest is more effective than riots or strikes? Does anyone have any ideas?
Well, there's an easier method for people to participate because in violent protests, you need a gun, and usually it would be traditionally like the men of the house would do it. But like a peaceful protest, like anyone can be a part of it, and you don't need anything except like an umbrella or like a green hijab in the case of Iran.
Totally. So, come one, come all. Bring a green hijab or bring an umbrella. That's all you need. Maybe some rain boots. if you have that, join us in the square. We're going to bring about democracy. That's a very inclusive message, and it's inclusive in that everyone can participate in that. And not so if you need a weapon, or if you have to belong to a union, or if you have to be willing to throw a Molotov cocktail, or if you know how to make one. These are all differences between, say, peaceful protest and riots or strikes. And it means then that it's not just more inclusive peaceful protest, it's also more likely to kind of bring together a much larger group of people. And so maybe in one sense, peaceful protest lends itself to just much, much larger uprisings and much larger social revolutions than, say, riots or strikes. And maybe it's the size of the revolution that matters so much, and not necessarily what the protesters are actually doing in the course of the revolution. Now, that's an interesting idea. Are there other takes? Let's say I'm a, a dictator, and let's say that I depend on certain types of economic relationships, trading relationships with democracies in other countries in the world. And let's say that there's a huge peaceful protest in the square, and I go out and I call on the military to go out in the streets and gun them down. Will that reflect positively on me? And will that improve, or will that harm my economic relationships with those other countries? What do you think? Any ideas? Oh, it's okay, Julissa, no problem. So I was just giving you a hypothetical. I was saying, suppose I'm a dictator, and out there in the square, there's a big protest against my dictatorship, and the protesters are demanding a democratic transition. And to repress them, I call on the military and I tell the military to gun them down in the streets. Now, will that reflect on me positively when it comes to my relationships with international economic partners or other countries? Will that help me in those relationships, or will that hurt me as the dictator who relies on those economic partnerships? Karen says that will definitely harm you because you're just trying to eliminate the issue and not give the people protesting a chance to explain themselves. Well, do you think that those other countries want to be associated with someone who guns down their citizens in broad daylight? I mean, would you stay friends with someone like that? Arturo says, hell no. Let's hear from some more of y'all. Tyler says, yeah, I'm sorry, but I wouldn't trade with you. Julissa says, I think it depends on the country you're partnered with. If you're partnered with a democracy, that will harm you for sure because they will not want to be associated with someone who guns their citizens down. Now, if it's another dictatorship where the dictator has the same ideas and views, then they might not care about remaining economic partners. I'm not sure if that answer is right, but I'm not sure about this specific topic. No, Julissa, that's right on. I think you're exactly right. Like, there are reputational issues involved, right? And there are costs that come along with any behavior that governments choose to take. And unless you're dealing primarily with other dictatorships, those democracies might not look kindly upon you if you gun down your own citizens, and they might be more likely to sanction you. Maybe they're more likely to support international efforts to remove you from power. These are all possibilities. And so there are consequences. And when we start to talk about some of the reasons that peaceful demonstrations work, we quickly find ourselves at this kind of point where we discover that peaceful demonstrations met with violence paint the regime in a very bad light. And it makes it more likely that other actors will exert pressure on them to acquiesce to a democratic transition. This is part of the reason that peaceful demonstrations are so useful, because it's the contrast between the peaceful demonstrations of the protesters and the violent repression of the state that throws the regime into perilous circumstances and makes them vulnerable to sanctions or to ultimately stepping down from power and calling elections. Yoel says, it depends on what countries. I think the US wouldn't care as long as you're a capitalist, since it coincides with their ruling class interests. The US is certainly okay with China's concentration camps on their minority group. Can't remember the name. The Uyghurs. That's a good point, Yoel. It depends on the interests of the state, right? That's certainly true. Arturo says, that's why North Korea and China are buddies, right? Yeah, totally. And that's why Venezuela and Russia are buddies with North Korea and China, and so on and so forth. Jose says, I would disagree. If they are wealthy and hold power over a block of a continent, they do not care what others may say. Let's take China as an example. Muslims are being forced into concentration camps, yet the world is still trading with them because they are one of the stronger financial powers of the world. But Jose, there's a point here that you yourself are conceding to. China is a very powerful actor, and China is not a typical dictatorship. China is less vulnerable to the kind of fallout that I'm talking about, precisely because they're in a dominant position economically and because so many countries depend on them. For example, Chile sells most of its copper, which is its main export and what it gets most of its revenue from, to China. What that means then is Chile is in a difficult position if they want to criticize China, because China purchases all of its copper. But China is not like other dictatorships, which are in many cases much smaller and less important economically. That means then that they don't have the same latitude that a China might have. China might be a unique case. And it's true that what they're doing to the Uyghurs is absolutely terrible and horrific. But part of the reason they're able to do so might be because they're in this sort of dominant economic position, at least relative to most countries in the world. But Jose, your point is a fair one, because I think that if a regime chooses to stay a path, it will simply do that. And countries like North Korea and Venezuela seem to show that to be true. Luis says, I think the masses still have the power to make their leaders responsible for relationships with other countries that they do not agree with. So if other partners do not handle the situation responsibly, then they will taint that relationship. Okay, interesting, good. So let's continue. Let's talk about why peaceful popular mobilization is the ticket. Why is it that peaceful protest is so important, and what is the advantage of peaceful protest? Well, it's kind of paradoxical, but there are really three reasons why peaceful protest is more effective than riots or strikes or violent protest. And the first one is peaceful protest is much more inclusive. It provokes a large number of people. Like I said, if you have an umbrella, if you have something green, if you have, shoes on your feet, go out in the streets, join us. We're fighting for democracy. You're going to get way more people involved in your struggle than you will if you're saying, oh, you need a gun, you need a Molotov cocktail, you need a union membership card, you need directions from a union leader, etc. That means then that popular protest on the whole is going to involve many more people in society and people from many more walks of life and backgrounds and social classes. That unity in the size of the protest often means that it's a very imposing force, even though they're not using violence. Secondly, popular mobilization is very effective at exacerbating elite divisions. And the reason is because whenever you have a popular mobilization, there are going to be parts of the authoritarian regime that say, just don't even mess with them. Just gun them down in the streets, just end it, crush them. Then you'll have another half, the softliners, who say, no, we can't gun them down. That'll come back to haunt us. We'll be prosecuted later. We'll be prosecuted for human rights violations or war crimes even, whatever. In this division between softliners and hardliners within the regime, it brings the regime down in some cases because it contributes to conflict that cannot be resolved within the regime, and that weakens the regime, and that makes it so that transitioning to democracy is actually more favorable of an outcome than trying to stay the course and sustain the regime in the face of such paralyzing fragmentation within the ruling elite. This is especially important because the size of the mobilization will often further exacerbate those divisions. The larger the mobilization, the more of an impulse some in the regime will feel to use violence. At the same time, the more of an impulse some in the regime will feel to negotiate. And that widening of those divisions will further kind of give way to those negotiations that might eventually lead to democratization. And then thirdly, there's the simple fact that popular mobilization tends to mobilize third parties against the regime. Because anytime you have a massive peaceful protest, the state will use some means to repress that protest, even if all they're doing is using tear gas or water cannons. All they're doing is those are forms of repression, but those are forms of repression that are lighter and softer than, say, gunning people down in the streets. But even those forms of repression, the tear gas, the water cannons, that repression will mobilize third parties against the regime. And those third parties can be other countries. They can be those inside the country who did not join the protest, but who see the response of the state and then choose to join the protest. It might mean international organizations and so on and so forth. In this collection of third parties that mobilizes against the regime in support of the opposition can tilt the balance of power. They can do so through sanctions imposed by outside countries. They can do so through conditionalities imposed by international organizations that demand concessions to the protesters or negotiations towards democracy. In general, the mobilization of these third parties can become incredibly important because, again, it can tilt the balance of power and it can really, really put the regime in a vulnerable position. And so where we began thinking that riots and strikes might be more important because violence is more visible, what we're actually learning is that the size of popular protests, if they're peaceful, is often more visible, in that the divisions that often result from disagreements within the regime are often very paralyzing, in that the mobilization of third parties that stems from the response of the regime to the protest is also consequential in a third sense. And so popular protest is really important, but contrast this with violent popular protest, riots and strikes. If you're engaged in a riot or a strike, you might need weapons or physical fitness. That means far fewer people are going to get involved. You're not going to have the grandmas. You're not going to have the children. You're not going to have the peasants or the teachers. You're not going to have the students. You're going to have young, able-bodied men who have guns, are part of militias, or are in unions. That's what you'll have primarily. And that means you'll have a much smaller protest movement. And that means that those individuals in that movement will have to engage in far more activity and use far more violence than would those protesters in a peaceful movement when it comes to their use of nonviolent means. And secondarily, and maybe more importantly, violence begets violence. If you use violent means, it justifies the state's use of repression in response. Think about it. If you're rioting or striking, if you're destroying property, you're acting outside of the bounds of the law. And even though it's the state that creates those laws, and even though those laws themselves might be unjust in other ways, it justifies the state's response in the form of the same violence that you already engaged in. And that is repression in the state's expression of it. And so it uses the military, it uses the police, it uses the security forces to go out into the streets, to use those weapons, to use those water cannons, and often to use much more heavy-handed tactics. And then finally, violent protest also tends to alienate supporters. And what this means is you're going to lose the center. There are going to be a lot of people who won't join the cause because they won't support the use of violence. It's often also going to solidify the regime elites because they sense a common enemy. There's going to be a much smaller role for those soft liners because virtually everyone in the regime will respond to the violence in the same way by determining that violence has to be the proper response, because otherwise the survival of the regime is in question. If you don't give those soft liners a reason to support negotiating some sort of outcome, they won't negotiate an outcome, and instead they'll side with the hardliners, and it will solidify those regime elites. And then finally, it polarizes third parties. And so what this means is that those third countries and those international organizations that might otherwise side with those popular protesters, well, they're going to be less likely to become engaged because both actors are using violent means. And so where they can't easily support one side, they're much more likely to just simply not do so. But the question still remains, why is it that popular protest, and peaceful popular protest in particular, is effective? Why is it that peaceful popular protest actually causes the regime to step down or to call elections or to negotiate a transition? And what we know is that it works because it exploits what we call the regime's dependence relations. And so the regime depends on the military, the police, administrators, workers, and energy supply, transportation, communications, commerce. All of these sectors are incredibly important to the state because they help to uphold the system of the monopoly of violence that the state represents. And so the reason that peaceful protest is so important is because it can cause any one of these sectors to refuse or threaten to refuse to carry out their duties. And that in turn can cause the state's power to be significantly undermined. In facing these divisions, the regime may acquiesce to the challengers' demands and permit that negotiation or call those elections. And so when peaceful protests erupt and these divisions within the regime emerge, it's very, very likely that those dependence relations will break down. And if those relations break down, and if there's a refusal to carry out essential duties that the state depends on, the regime can totally collapse because it will be forced to sort of negotiate or acquiesce to the challengers' demands because of its absence of continued support. So let's take a look at some examples. We have just a couple more minutes left, and what I think I'm going to do is just finish out these examples and finish out the lecture. I'll record the full lecture. If you have to go, that's fine, but I think that it's useful for us to just finish this up because I've got 4 examples that I want to give you. The first example is from 2011, the example of Tunisia. Tunisia was the first country in the Middle East to go into uprising during what we call the Arab Spring, which began in 2011 and was characterized by these popular revolts in Middle Eastern countries where protesters pushed for democracy. The regime ordered the military to respond by using repression. They demanded that they use all means necessary to crush the revolts. Now, the military refused to obey. Military generals were already citing pay grievances, and they were also concerned about being prosecuted for human rights violations later, should they obey orders and use repression to crush the rebellion. Now, what happened? Well, when the military refused to obey, it altered those dependence relations that I just talked about. And in response, the regime totally collapsed. There was a call for elections, a transition ensued. That happened because the regime could not survive without the support of the military. The military's refusal to obey altered the balance of power. The military effectively sided with the protesters, giving them the power. That determined the eventual outcome of this uprising, that outcome being a transition to democracy. If the military had not refused to obey, the effort would have failed, and those dependence relations would not have broken down. Let's look at the example of the Philippines. Between 1983 and 1986, there was a series of demonstrations, shutdowns of public and private transportation, and there were a lot of sit-ins carried out by teachers and students and peasants. By February of 1986, the dictator, Ferdinand Marcos, was seeking legitimacy and seeking to shore up his government, and he called elections. Now, the opposition candidate actually won the votes, but Marcos declared victory and tried to stay in power. But the opposition planned a huge demonstration in response, and they planned to carry out a massive, massive uprising that would unsettle the status quo and bring down the government. But believe it or not, it was actually preempted by an abortive military coup planned by generals in Marcos's own government. And at this point, the US administration withdrew its support. At that moment, the withdrawal of support was pivotal because it meant that a key backer of that regime no longer was in place. And it further discredited Marcos and took away any legitimacy he had, and it spelled the end of the regime. Marcos fell shortly thereafter, and elections took place. This is a picture from the People's Power protest in Manila in 1986, and it shows you what that looked like on that day when this picture was taken. And as before, you see participation from people of all backgrounds in classes and social classes. This is the nature of a popular protest, and this is the nature of one that is successful in bringing about a democratic transition. Let's take a look at the example of South Africa. In 1989, there were a number of key organizations that led stayaways. These were basically days where people stayed home and issued demands for a democratic transition. Now, these people included everyone from teachers to workers to peasants and so on. But these protesters were instrumental because they won third-party support from both South Africans and abroad. And they particularly won support for the cause of eradicating segregation in South Africa, apartheid, which was the form that it took in South Africa. Apartheid was closely linked to the survival of the authoritarian regime because it was a dictatorship that was controlled by the whites, which were a tiny minority in South Africa. Now, as the regime lost legitimacy and as third-party support increasingly shifted to the protesters, elite divisions festered, and the hardliners and the softliners began to split. And there was a division that arose that could not be overcome. Simultaneously, as protests are mounting, the regime is drained of resources, and there's an invigoration of international sanctions. These sanctions help to further tilt the balance of power away from the regime and towards the protesters. What happens in turn? Well, the rest is history. South Africa transitions to democracy, and apartheid comes to an end. This is what apartheid and the protests that it gave rise to looked like in the 1980s in South Africa. This was a struggle that was closely linked, if not exclusively linked, to the eradication of apartheid. Apartheid was understood as an authoritarian system. Democracy for South Africa would mean not just democratic politics, but ending apartheid. And so this is what freedom meant in the case of South Africa. We've got one more example and then we'll be done. I'm so sorry, but thank you for staying with us, everyone, if you're still here. The example of Nepal. In February 1990, a new opposition coalition between leftist parties launched an unarmed popular uprising in Nepali cities. And it was met with force. And the coalition originally faltered, but it regained momentum through a variety of different actions like blackouts and other inventive measures that were designed to increase solidarity and visibility while not kind of confronting the regime in a violent way. And as the strikes and the demonstrations mounted and continued, King Buriinda, who had been in power for many, many years, gave in, and he lifted the ban on political parties. Negotiations ensued, a new constitution was written, and eventually elections took place. Now, Nepal was another example of the mounting costs of repression in the face of popular peaceful protest. When you're using repression to subdue popular peaceful protesters, it looks bad, and it drains the state of resources, and it really forces the hand of the regime. And in this case, the result was a lifting of the ban on parties, negotiations towards democracy, and then eventually those founding elections. Now, this is a picture of Nepal from 1990, the People's Movement. And again, what you see is you see ordinary people engaged in this popular struggle, united together, sharing a common destiny, a vision of what a democracy would look like in Nepal, in imagining moving beyond the shackles of monarchy in Nepal. Now, Nepal had experienced democracy briefly in the 1960s after gaining independence, but it was a very fragile democracy that eventually gave way to authoritarian rule. The return of democracy was very much anticipated and very much appreciated by these protesters and the millions of others and the hundreds of thousands of others who joined together and joined hands on single days of protests in 1990 in Nepal. And so this brings our lecture to an end. And what I want you to take from this is that there are very clear implications for pro-democracy movements. It may not be the answer that we hoped for or that we even fully understand yet, but the consensus appears to be that peaceful protest is the best way to bring about a democratic transition. If our goal is to democratize, we're best served by using peaceful means of doing so, because it divides the regime, it mobilizes third parties, and it expands the radius of support and participation in our movement. And so this does conclude the discussion and the lecture. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. You can hang around if you want to ask me questions, but I will, of course, post this and you can access it later as always. Thank you very much for being here, everybody, and I'll see you on Monday.